welcome everybody to this Nest Insights webinar on supporting emergency saving, early learnings from the employer experience. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. There's still a couple of people drifting in, but I think we're going to kick off and make a start. So just before we get into the proper meat of the discussion, a few small bits of housekeeping from me. Obviously, first and foremost, I'm sure everyone is now very used to these online events. But please bear with us if there are any technical glitches along the way. Obviously, those can happen, and we'll try and make sure that they're resolved quickly. But if anything does go wrong, just bear with us. For those who've just joined, if your screen is currently showing kind of everything in equal sized boxes, then you can click on the box with the slides in if you want to shift it so that the slides take up most of your screen. It can make it a bit easier to see the slides, although there are not a lot of slides involved at all in today's webinar, you'll probably be pleased to know. Aside from those of us on the panel, everyone who's joined will be muted to make sure that the sound for the event works okay. But we do really want this to be an interactive session. You should see on your control panel a Q&A box. Please, as people are speaking and when we throw it open to Q&A at the end, please do add your questions and those will come through to me and I'll share them with our panelists. If you want to direct them at anyone in particular, please say so in the question. Otherwise, we'll sort of throw it open to the panelists to share their views. Please also do share information about today on social media, in particular tweeting using the hashtag sidecar savings. We're keen to make sure that people are kind of aware of what we're doing and following on with what's going on. So to kick off properly for the session. So as hopefully many of you will be aware, today we've published some new research. It's the second in a series of briefing papers from the early experience of our emergency savings project. And this one looking particularly at the experience of employers and those around employers of offering sidecar savings, of offering jars, which we'll talk about a bit more in a minute. That research should be reachable via the handout section on your control panel, but is also available on the Nest Insight website if you want to go and find the research in more detail. We've got a great panel today, and we're really keen to spend most of the time hearing from them and hearing their thoughts on this really important topic. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the detail of the research at all. I'm just going to talk just for a couple of minutes at the start about the sidecar trial, just to remind people kind of what it is and how it works. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Joe, who's just going to talk briefly about some of the headlines we've seen in the research that we published today. And then we're going to throw open to each of our panelists in turn, and I'll introduce them as we go so that you've got the introduction kind of fresh in your mind as you hear people speak. And then, as I say, we'll have some time at the end to throw it open to Q&A for the whole group. So thank you again for joining us, and we will press on. So Gwen, if you could just forward the slide for me. So just by way of a quick reminder, really, a couple of slides about the sidecar trial. So the sidecar savings trial is a trial of a product that's called JARS. That's run for us by, developed and run for us by Salary Finance, who we'll be hearing from shortly. And it's essentially a trial of a payroll deduction emergency savings tool slotted in alongside the workplace pension in UK workplaces. Supported by BlackRock, JPMorgan Chase Foundation and the Money and Pension Service, for whose support we're extremely grateful. What we're trying to do is look at the impact on people's savings behaviours of having access to a tool like this, but also on the impact on their broader financial well-being. And to do that, we're working both with the research team at the Money and Pension Service and also a group of academics led by Sarah Holmes Berk and David Laibson, primarily at Harvard, but also some partner institutions in the US. As I said, the savings technology partner who worked with us to develop JARS is Salary Finance. The underpinning savings account is provided by the Yorkshire Building Society. And JARS is currently available at 4 UK employers: BT, Step Change, Timpson and the University of Glasgow. We'll be hearing from a couple of those organisations on today's panel as well. So next slide, please, Gwen. So just to describe in a little bit more detail kind of what JARS is and how it works. So we think of this as a kind of a pair of accounts, a 2-account payroll deduction model, where one account is the instant access emergency savings account and the other is the workplace pension. And in a sense, the most unique and kind of innovative feature of this is the automatic rollover. So when someone reaches a certain threshold in their emergency savings account, their future contributions then roll over to become top-up contributions on top of the base level of auto-enrollment pension contributions. JARS is offered as a benefit by employers, so it will form part of a benefits offer from employers. And as I say, we'll be hearing about some of the employers working with us in the trial shortly. In the current trial, it's completely voluntary for the individual on an opt-in basis. So the individual signs up at a dedicated salary finance webpage, having been offered the chance to do so by their employer, or in some cases does so via their dedicated employee benefits platform. And the user has two settings they have to define. The first is how much they want to save each pay period, and the second is the level of that target over which the contributions become additional pension contributions, but they can change either of those parameters any time that they like. Next slide, please, Gwen. And in terms of the research and kind of why Net Insight got into this and what we're looking for, we're really trying to understand, does creating this tier account model with a link between short-term and longer-term and liquid savings create an appropriate balance of overall liquidity and flexibility to individuals in a way that enhances their financial well-being? And so through the research, we're exploring things like how many workers sign up and who are they, how do they use the emergency account, how much do they save, but also how frequently and at what kind of levels do they withdraw? And then crucially, over the longer term, has having access to sidecar enhanced their financial well-being and resilience as a sort of in its entirety, which is really the underlying kind of principle behind wanting to offer something like JARS in the first place. As I said, today's discussion and the research we published today is very much about the employer experience of offering JARS or considering offering JARS, both in terms of the employers themselves and those who work with and around employers. I'm just going to hand over to Joe to talk briefly about some of the kind of headlines that we feel are most relevant from that research before we move on to talk to our panelists. So next slide, please, Gwen, and over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Will. So we know that employers can play a really key role in offering the sidecar savings tool as an employment benefit, and we were really keen therefore to learn from employers as early as possible in the trial about what their experience is. So in this early qualitative research, we conducted 18 interviews, both with employers who are offering the JARS savings tool. I'm really delighted to have Kerry from BT and Marion from Timpson here today to talk about their experience much better than I can. We also spoke to some employers who are still thinking about offering JARS or who had thought about offering JARS and decided not to for various reasons. So it's quite a rounded view. I'm just going to give a really quick overview of some of the early learning headlines. There's more detail in our report, as Will said. But what have we learnt so far from the employer point of view? So in the research, we found that employer support for the concept of sidecar savings is really high, and that's partly because saving is particularly salient this year when so many of their employees have experienced uncertainty or disruption to their income. And in that environment, employers are perhaps even more aware than ever of the financial vulnerability of their employees and the impact that can have both on them as individuals and also them as workers, as employees. Responses were positive, particularly to aspects of the design like the idea of payroll deductions, so that savings are made before the money hits the individual's pockets. That particularly resonated with employers, and also the idea of making it easier and more convenient for people to start saving, but by setting up the savings tool for them and having it there ready for them to use. We found, though, sort of looking at the concept in a bit more detail with employers, that they come at it from different angles. So as Will said, JARS is a hybrid savings tool, and it combines the emergency savings with retirement, with pension savings. And depending on who the employer decision maker was and what their kind of overall benefit strategy was, the kind of relative importance of those two aspects varied. For most employers, they were more focused on the emergency savings side of JARS. That's partly because with pensions auto enrolment, there's already something in place for retirement saving, whereas for many employers, the sort of shorter term saving feels like a bit more of a gap in the benefit strategy that they have. Sort of, there were some employers who put more emphasis on the pensions rollover, were perhaps coming at it from the point of view of trying to increase pension saving in their workforce or boosting engagement with their pension offer. But for the most part, the focus was more on the emergency savings side of JARS. Our third learning was really that implementation has gone pretty smoothly, and that JARS is not a difficult benefit to implement and roll out, or sort of no more difficult than any other new benefit. But there are clearly challenges at any time to introducing a new benefit. It has to fit with all of the other priorities and the existing strategy. And then obviously, particularly this year, there have been challenges for employers in the context of COVID, looking ahead to Brexit, all the other things that everyone's been dealing with. So, I think it's worth recognising that even in a situation where we have a benefit that is relatively easy to roll out, that there's no charge for offering jars, there are still challenges, and employers still have to do quite a lot of work to offer this to their employees. And then the other thing that I think we heard loud and clear from all the employers that we spoke to is that building engagement is challenging, even when you have a good product that employees are interested in, that they want to use. There are still challenges to getting employees to actually take it up, even with a good communication strategy, even with a good engagement plan. And so we did hear, from some of the employers we spoke to, some sort of concerns about, even with this in place, how many employees are actually going to take that up, and our employers are actively thinking about how to encourage take up. So these findings will inform our future research programme, including, particularly on that last point, our work to develop and test an opt-out version of sidecar saving next year, to look at whether changing that joining mechanism from opt-in to opt-out has an impact on participation and overcome some of those inertia barriers. But as I've said, there is much more in the report, but we're keen to sort of hear experiences firsthand from the panel we have, so I'll hand back to Will.
Great, thank you, Choi. And as Joe said, we've got a great panel with us, and we're really keen to kind of bring them in and hear their views. So we're going to turn to each of them in turn. I'll introduce each of them as part of their kind of introductory comments or initial comments. And so we're going to start with Sasha Romanovic, who's the CEO of Fair for All Finance, and also chairs the Money and Pension Service Challenge Group on the Workplace. So Sasha, just starting with you, welcome your thoughts on all of this, but I guess in particular, keen to understand what is it about the workplace that is so important in this picture and that makes it such a good potential springboard for financial wellbeing interventions?
Hi, thanks, Will. And I'm sure that Marion and Kerry will give us much more richness on this. But I think in looking at the Money and Pension Service Challenge with Workplace, there was an assumption that Workplace would be, this absolutely essential route to actually reach as many workers as possible. And I think that what we found is that is true if and only if. And I think there are two things. One is that it's made as easy as possible for employers, and particularly for smaller employers who often don't have a lot of people in their HR teams to be able to implement things. But then also that with employees, there needs to be this relationship with trust, and recognise that even when you've got organisations that have got really financially literate, well-educated people, they are not great at spending time on this stuff. And I had that personal experience when I was leading Grant Thornton, that I think that something like 98% of our people just went for the default choices in our beautifully constructed benefit system. And I think that probably the key thing that we really zoned in on, which was that actually, if you can focus on what is the relationship between the employer and the employee, and what might be the natural touch points where this could be a conversation to be had to actually get that engagement, that felt the most important thing. And we called them, out of the Money and Pension Service, we called them the moments that matter. And I think that's going to go through a bit of a branding exercise as to whether that lands. But just recognizing that actually there are these points in someone's employment which actually are often instigated by the employer, which provide these perfect points to actually enable people to make choices. So whether that's when you're being offered a job and starting work, whether when you've got a promotion, whether you're going on parental leave, when you're coming up to retirement planning, that there are these key points in a person's career that are actually also natural points for HR departments, which create this real opportunity to have that conversation and engage people. And I think the other thing, and I know it's something we talked about with Joe, is I think that the more that you can make this stuff by default to make things happen, the more likely that you get take up. And there's so much behavioural research. I think it's probably worthwhile saying that I think that a lot of credit unions have established really great partnerships with employers to actually encourage this type of saving. And, you know, we know that even going into the COVID-19 crisis, that there were some 12 million people who had less than £50 in savings. And, you know, another 12 million, I think, had less than £500 in savings. So for a significant portion of the UK population, a washing machine breaking down is actually a life-changing experience. And I think we've also managed to really evidence the mental and physical health challenges that that puts on people, which can be the hidden side that employers might experience, where someone's productivity drops off or what have you. All sorts of things happen when they're carrying that type of stress. And that's the kind of the secondary relationship with employers, which they may or may not know what's going on in someone's life like that. Employees don't always want to talk to their employer about those challenges. But if you're creating a mechanism where they can be building that resilience and building that buffer, then the risk of employees getting into that situation just changes dramatically. So I'm really excited with this pilot, and I have to say we're just figuring out. We've just done a review of our benefits at Fair for All Finance. We're a tiny team, but we're building in sidecar savings and actually building it that by default people are saving to set them up to save at least £500 a year, where they have to do something active to actually not save, so they can access it anytime, but just trying to actually really create those habits that enable people to build resilience. So I think probably those are opening comments, but I shall defer because there are much more brilliant people on the panel than me who can give insights on this.
That's great. Thank you, Saja. Really, really great insights there. And we'll come back to you in due course. I'm going to turn now to Kerry Shields, who's the Pensions Director at BT. Kerry, could you perhaps talk to us a bit about kind of why BT wanted to offer JARS, where it fits within your broader pensions and benefits package?
I can, but the phrase of the year, I need to come off mute, I suppose. I mean, most people know BT, but you know, those large brands out there as PlusNet and EE and BT TV, and BT's been on, you know, and is going through a transformation in terms of what it looks and feels like, both to the consumer and obviously inside BT. We have a large legacy population, those guys out in the vans that you will have all have seen, and they've traditionally had very long service, and quite key to this, I think, traditionally had DB benefits. So they've been looked after with a very rich benefit package, which effectively means they didn't need to think about things too much. And back in 2018, we closed our DB scheme to future accrual, and actually in 2018 was a milestone point for BT as well, where we then had more people, even before closure, we had more than 50% of people in a DC scheme as opposed to a DB. And then of course, post closure, everybody. So, you know, in the UK, you know, north of 70,000 people. And so my role as pensions director started to change a little bit. And, you know, my focus is much more now, not necessarily in the traditional retirement product, but in terms of long-term savings. And we've got lots of people in the business in very, you know, different scenarios. And one of the, I guess, in terms of our kind of traditional benefit package and reward offering, one of the things that we felt was lacking was this opportunity for people to save for that emergence. So save for the washing machine, just to use Sasha's example. We've got, you know, great products for long-term savings, but we definitely had a gap. And we also knew that in many parts of our business, and tend to be the lower paid parts, you know, call centres, retail staff, that sort of thing, people struggle to save. And sometimes, you know, that obviously is because of a budget, but quite often it's behavioural. But for whatever reason, people can't save that £500. What we do know is it creates stress on those people. You know, they're less productive, and in some cases they can't even afford the bus fare to get to work. So we felt, you know, we need to look at long-term savings, but actually we've got somewhere we need to actually focus on the short term to sort of enable the long term as well. Without taking up the whole hour of talking about this, I think that probably, you know, sets the scene as to why we were really interested to see what the interest was within our workforce, and kind of pleased to put JARS in, really. and it was timed perfectly, kind of with the closure of the DB scheme, I guess.
Great, thank you, Kerry. Really great comments there. I'm going to move now to Marion Hart, who has possibly my favourite job title of anyone I've ever met. She is a financial first aider at Timpson. So Marion, kind of given that role, it'd be great to hear just kind of what you hear from your colleagues day to day on their financial well-being, what you hear about how Timpson can support them, and where something like JARS fits in with that. What can you be doing to support them moving through to financial security?
Okay, hi everyone. Well, we've had JARS as an offering, as a benefit for a few years actually within the Timpson group, but it hasn't really been taken up until now. We're going to do a big push on it, and I believe we need to do that because in my role I spend so much time visiting and speaking to people who've got financial struggles, mainly debt related, and these people can't even think about saving. They're just thinking about getting through from one day to the next. And the reason my role became apparent, and I've been doing it for 12 months now, was because we've got a great benefit scheme. One of our benefits is crisis loans. And we found that there's more and more people taking us up on crisis loans, asking for advances. We didn't want to mask it. We wanted to get under it and find out what was going on and spend more time with people. So I was put into this role, having worked with the business for a long time, and I really get the culture. And I think that Timpson are in a really good position to be able to get this out to colleagues because we're quite an open business. We chat. We've got an upside down management system where people are not afraid to speak to their managers about problems because, you know, we like to help people and give back. And like I said, I'm really excited about this. This is going to be my push for next year. Every person I visit, every person I speak to who's got a financial problem, I want to try and help them to be in a position where they're able to save, even if it's something and small, and it's so easy to implement as well. And I was sat with Gail, who runs our payroll yesterday. She said it takes 10-20 minutes to set up. It's really easy to set up. It takes 20 minutes to do as a colleague, and straight away your money's building and building and building it, and people can sleep at night. It's fabulous product.
Brilliant, thank you, Marion. Really great to hear how it's viewed within Timpson, and also how you think it could be kind of rolled out further. I'm going to turn now to Gemma Burrows, who's a director at Willis Towers Watson. And Gemma, I guess interested in what you hear from your employer clients and what kind of appetite there is around this whole financial wellbeing issue, and has it changed at all as a result of COVID?
Yeah, well, thanks. It's great to be here, and actually to follow on by it from some of these comments, I think there certainly is an appetite from employers to support financial well-being. Sasha gave some facts earlier about the number of people, you know, and the access that they have to emergency savings, and the impact then of those financial concerns on employees in the workforce. And actually, we know that there is, as well as an appetite, there's a value for employers in supporting financial well-being. In fact, at Willis Towers Watson, we did a global benefits and attitudes survey at the end of last year, and we found that 36% of people said that money concerns prevented them from doing the best at their job. And we also know that financial concerns have an impact on productivity. They have an impact on absenteeism and presenteeism, which is a term I wasn't even really familiar with until very recently. But, you know, this idea of being physically present, but mentally distracted and not able to really perform. And we know that in excess of 4 extra days are lost as a result of absenteeism and presenteeism. So there's definitely value for employers in supporting financial well-being. And actually, I think that the impact of COVID-19 has actually brought that into a sharper focus for employers. We did a survey amongst our clients earlier in the year when COVID-19 sort of, you know, we all went from working normally and hearing about COVID-19 as on the news, to being at home, working from home. Many businesses had to shut down. People were furloughed. We had children at home, back from schools, and so there was a massive change. And we wanted to understand the impact that was having on our clients. And what we found in that survey is that actually financial well-being was now a top 3 priority for employers. So I think there really is an appetite for employers to play an important role in this, and I think that's come into a sharper focus as a result of COVID-19.
Perfect, thank you, Gemma. And then finally, just by way of initial remarks, Asesh Sarkar, who's the CEO and co-founder of Salary Finance, who, as I've said, are working with us on delivering this project. Asesh, just any thoughts from you on how you put together a package of support for employees that kind of meets the needs they have, meets them where they are, recognizing there's also kind of spectrum of financial well-being issues and kind of product responses that might be there to support them, and how is that going from Salary Finance's perspective? How what have you discovered in your work so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are about 5.5 years into building Salary Finance, and this is, we now reach about 550 clients in the UK. They employ about 3.5 million people, and when we started, I would say we started in companies which are kind of predominantly middle to low income, whereas actually now we have clients across pretty much all spectrums, right through to large accounting firms, law firms, and so forth. And kind of what we realized is that there is the problem is very complex. Different people have different issues. There is just people living in different parts of the country face different challenges, different stages of life. There's just an infinite amount of kind of permutations in terms of the challenges. And so for us, the solutions and the product, for us, there's no real kind of silver bullet. It's not like if you do one thing, suddenly everyone's problems are solved. So for us, we focus very much on this concept of a financial wellness platform. We do think that the workplace is a really good place to engage employees. We think clearly people come to work, it's where they get paid. There's a level of trust there. So we think the workplace channel is an important one. And for us, we have now built 6 or 7 products, this one being one of them, which kind of help people at different stages. And so whether it's we have 2 or 3 different types of savings products, and so different people that have are at different stages of savings. We have low interest loans. We allow people to get paid at a frequency which works for them. We do lots of education. So for us, really, that there is no silver bullet, and so we think this kind of very much holistic approach, different products for different people, engage at the right time is kind of what we've really focused on. And then we've seen kind of good outcomes as a result. We have across our product selection, we have some clients where certain products are really take up is high, benefits are really high, and in other clients very different. So yeah, so for us it's very much around this kind of holistic approach, not being too obsessed about any single product, but really constantly learning, constantly evolving, and having a real kind of broad set of things that can help people.
Great, thank you, Asesh. I'm just going to turn for sort of the first reaction to that to Joe, and ask you, Joe, just to kind of add any additional flavour from the research that relates to what we've heard, and just any other kind of thoughts you have immediately back to what our panellists have said so far.
Yeah, I think some of the things that people have shared from different angles reflect, really what Asesh was just saying, that employees are at different places, and we know that one of the results of the COVID pandemic is that we've got people who are perhaps more able to save than they were before, and we've got people who are less able to save than they were before. And I think what we heard in the research from employers is that creates some challenges in terms of communication and engagement with JARS, but also some opportunities. So I know, for example, that Timpson Marion is thinking about how do you work with people who are currently indebted and working to pay off that debt, to translate that into a savings amount once the loan is paid off. And I think one thing that's in the current context with all the challenges that employers have in communication is emerging as something for us to think about going forward, is what is the right way to position JARS alongside other benefits that employers may offer in a way that means that it can fit at the point in the journey where people are at, or be ready for them when they get there. So interested to hear sort of any other thoughts on that from other panelists.
Great, thank you, Choi. So we're going to throw it open to Q&A now. We've already had a couple of questions in, which I'll put to the panel in a minute. But for anyone listening, please do add your questions into the Q&A. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. Picking up on the first of these, so we've had a question about debt and personal debt, and kind of how the interaction works for individuals who are indebted, who potentially should be paying down debt before they're trying to save more, which is definitely something that we've thought a bit about. But there are a number of people on the panel whose views on this I think will be really helpful. So I don't know, I wonder whether maybe Marian, I mean, you're very close day to day to colleagues who may be suffering from this kind of issue and this kind of trade-off. What do you make of the whole trade-off between people who are indebted paying down those debts versus trying to start saving?
Yeah, I think most of the colleagues that I see who've got debt issues are really not thinking about saving. And I think Joe and I chatted about this just after the first lockdown when we started talking about jazz, and I said I don't feel like the business is in any position to speak to anyone at the moment about saving. I think most people are just trying to get through from day to day. But when I see people, and if they have got debt issues and we were able to sort out an issue to help them as a business, so therefore we give them a crisis loan, what we're hoping to achieve at the end of that is that they will be debt free, and as they're coming to the end of paying their loan off, they're able to then turn most of that or some of that repayment then into savings. And that's something we want to educate our colleagues on. It's all about well, from our side, we feel like it's more about education to have it drilled in to save, so you're not worrying. We've got a lot of people who are struggling and they're worrying whilst they're at work. Great.
I want to throw the same question open to anyone else who has views. I can imagine a whole load of perspectives we may have here. Sasha, you'd like to come in, which is great, because obviously for the Money and Pension Service, there's a whole tranche of work around debt alongside the work around savings. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, and it's probably worth saying in my hat at Fair for All Finance, for those who aren't familiar, we've been sort of set up, funded by Dormant Assets Money, with a very specific brief of how we can increase people's financial resilience and well-being through making sure the financial system is actually providing access to financial products and services that actually help them do that. And so that's looking at affordable credit, it's looking at savings, it's looking at assurance, the whole lot. I think what's brilliant is what we've seen is some of the credit unions and community finance development institutions, the CDFIs, are already doing this, have been experimenting quite a bit with this saving as you borrow, and using that so that, sometimes it's as simple as just actually offering people the opportunity to round up their repayment, and that can be matters of pence. So it really doesn't necessarily have to be significant in terms of the rounding up, but it means that by the time they've got to the end of their repaying their loan, they've also got the bonus, because then they've kind of got this bonus pot of maybe 20, 30, 40 pounds, which may not sound significant to many on the call, but for many in the UK, that's just a real bonus in terms of an amount. And so you start to build in, actually working with people's brain chemistry, really, you start to build in that habit and that sort of dopamine reward of like, oh my gosh, pennies saved up can really make a big difference. So I think that there is actually real power of thinking about, when we're using debt products, how we're sitting them alongside, because I think there's a real need for affordable credit out there for people. If you haven't got savings for a washing machine and you're living without, we've managed to prove that if you're actually able to get access to affordable credit to buy it, that will actually save you in your living costs and all sorts of different things about £30 a week. So using credit in a really focused way can be really important as a tool. Now imagine if you can get someone who bought it, is saving that £30 a week, and then is able to actually save some of that as they go, then you're starting using these financial tools to provide a real pathway to someone building their resilience. And I think, if we can start to think scientifically about human behaviour, interaction with the products, and thinking about wrapping them together, then I think we can really make sure we'll face the next big crisis, because there will be one, with people in a much better position, and that's got to be all of our goals.
Great, really fascinating response. Thank you, Sasha. I've got. Oh, sorry, Sasha, please go ahead. Here.
I was just going to kind of echo that. So, we've lent, almost £500 million now in affordable credit, and what we find is when you provide someone with affordable credit, principally to save their money relative to what they're paying before, they like you a lot. So, if you're looking at Trustpilot, it's like 4.9 out of 5, and when people like you, they also listen to you. And so then when we encourage them to save, they're more likely to listen to us because we've helped them out, we've made a difference to their life, there's a rapport built. And so we absolutely kind of buy into the thesis that kind of Sasha mentioned around this kind of pathway from kind of debt to savings, and ideally if you can do both at the same time. The one thing I would say is that sometimes there is a economically rational argument, which is if you have debts, you should not save, because every pound that you're saving you'll get better bang for buck on. For us, what we kind of see is actually, there is economic rationality and there is just kind of, mental how people process things. Quite often, even if someone is paying more by saving alongside debt, even though it might be costing them pounds more, the fact that they have some emergency savings is enormously valuable to them. We do lots of research in this, and so for us, we always, whenever we're designing products, features, doing research, we always try to kind of combine the economic rationality with actually what is it that makes people feel good. And quite often the two don't tally up, but we think they both have a place. And yeah, so for us, debt is very important. It's how you build trust. It solves a lot of the core issues, but actually savings for us is just as important, even if sometimes it is not necessarily the most economically rational thing to do.
Great, thank you. Got lots more questions coming in, so we'll move on from debt, even though I think it probably could be the topic of its own hour-long webinar very easily. This question was directed at Kerry, but it's possibly one that Marion may also want to come in on, which is just whether the implementation of JARS kind of went as you expected it to, and was there anything kind of unexpected that you learned from it, or any new insights that might shape the future of your financial wellbeing strategy for your employees? So start with Kerry and then Marion, by all means, jump in.
I'm not sure whether they mean the actual physical getting a thing implemented or behaviourally. I mean, actually implementing it went relatively smoothly, and we, as other people have commented, put it in with payroll and it was relatively okay, and our pension provider was able to support that as well. I think it's early days for us. We were caught up with the COVID, so we went live with JARS in early March, which is obviously bad timing from that point of view. And so whilst it was on our Flex Benefits platform and we did have some take up, what we didn't do is splash or big promotion internally, and we've done that, and we weren't able to do that until the past few weeks, and now we've done that. We've seen that take up's much higher. It's still relatively low numbers, but we sort of describe it as a bit of a grower internally. It's quite interesting just to look. It's fairly evenly spread, the take up, in terms of percentages of people across the business. I think you could draw all sorts of conclusions from the numbers. What we're seeing is those, perhaps I'm generalising, but lower paid bits of the business has been quite well taken up, which is possibly where we'd expect it. But also in the corporate teams, there's been a relatively good take up as well, and I suspect people are using it for different reasons, and not necessarily for emergency savings. But you would generalise, obviously, corporate staff have got sufficient money to save, but maybe they're just not programmed in that way, just to go back to Sasha's point, driving the behavioural point, and they recognise that. I think the good thing is those two groups of people on our workplace, which is our kind of, I don't know if people know workplace, but it's like our Facebook, but internally it's generated a conversation between those two groups of people. So I've got people saying, well, this isn't the best interest rate, I could get a much better interest rate in the market. And then other people are joining the conversation and saying that's not really the point of the product. It's not about BT offering you a really good deal on a savings account. And that's great. That's really great conversation to see, but it's early days. Yeah.
Great. And Marion, anything to add on sort of the implementation experience from your perspective? I think you're on mute, Marion.
Sorry. Gail, I wasn't involved in the implementation, so Gail said it was really easy, again, because we already work with salary finance, so it all just slotted in really quickly. I went on and I set one up myself just because I'm going to be trying to promote this to my colleagues, and it was just really easy. I've got an app on my phone and I can see the money going in each month, and I think for me, the selling point for me is going to be that it comes straight out your salary. It's a no-brainer, and people are going to love the idea that they don't have anything to do, particularly. It's all done for them, and it's in the background, and it's just mounting up and mounting up and mounting up, and it's a wonderful achievement for some people who've had tough times financially.
Great, thank you, Marion. So I'm going to direct at least the first part of the next question to Gemma. So, but then I'm sure it's something others will have views on as well. So a few times we've said, both in the findings from the research and in what we've heard from panelists, getting people to take this up and engage with it can obviously be a challenge. And I guess that's true of lots of opt-in benefits as well. But just from your perspective, in terms of working with employers thinking about implementing this kind of thing, do you have any insights on what can be done to drive up engagement and drive up take up of something like this, since we know it seems to be popular in principle but harder to get people to take it up in actuality?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think for lots of our employers, and Sasha mentioned as well in sort of earlier days, when you have this amazing benefits structure and access to all these things, there is just a bit of a barrier in actually getting people to engage with that and getting people to kind of take those benefits up, even though that you're providing a sort of good suite of different products and ways of helping people manage their financial position, be that long-term savings, short-term savings, debt management. So I think there's much more behavioural science that we know now about how to engage. I think key is communication, and actually reinforcing that communication as well. So sometimes sounding like a broken record, but actually, when we went into the COVID crisis, we found that employers were, the first stage was kind of managing that crisis, and so financial well-being was important, but actually it was about reinforcing what might already be there. So you're reminding people what they have access to. So I think it is a process of communication. I think those communications need to be timely. So obviously COVID is an example of such a trigger point. I think they need to be relevant as well. So people need to see what the relevance is for them as an individual. And also I think they need to be simple. I think as an industry, we're actually very bad at using language that folk just don't understand. They don't interact with that sort of language every day. And that in itself creates an immediate barrier to people engaging. So I think it's really important that we make those messages simple and easy to digest, and I think all of that will contribute towards helping people engage with the benefits and the strategies that employers are putting in place to help build that financial resilience.
Great, thanks, Gemma. And I'll throw that one open. Yeah, Sash, great. Carry on.
Yeah, I was just going to say we see across our clients real actually a very clear correlation, which is to what extent is a client able to get messages to their employees, and there's a lot to communicate, and so if there is awareness, take up tends to be good. Like most of these products are good products. Presuming the communications are simple, engaging, and so on. Once people know about them, the take up is good, but just getting that can be hard. And so in organizations where we do a letter home, for example, we have incredibly high take up. In organizations which are distributed and we're one of many things, take up is naturally lower. One of the things we have increasingly done now is actually started to use other channels, and so we're increasingly using for our loans product price comparison sites, for example. So someone goes on to ClearScore, they have 8 million people in the UK and more users. They go on, they look for a loan, suddenly all they have is kind of high cost options. They may work for one of our clients, simply don't know we exist for them. And so we then use them as a channel, and there's lots of other kind of price comparison sites too. And so for me, I think is a combination of traditional employer channels, and that's really a function of how much the employer cares, in that not cares as in cares relative to other things, like how much, if you have 10 things to land, what are you prioritizing? If you prioritize it, the message will get through. But then being creative in other channels, which also add cost. Using crowdsourcing sites does add to your kind of cost base, but ultimately it's an effective challenge to do. For me, what's really interesting is, whilst employers will sometimes find it hard to communicate with their employees, you'd be very surprised at how many of those employees are finding online payday lenders with hundreds of percent or thousands of percent, so people can get to them one way or the other. And so I think it is just a kind of combination of through the employer, but also other digital methods that are now available as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sash. Any other comments on driving take up? Otherwise, we've got a couple more questions I'd like to move to. Okay, so we'll move on. I mean, one question we've had, which of course we get asked, as you'd imagine, quite a lot, is just whether we're in a position to share any actual stats about take up yet. So sorry, but not quite yet, I'm afraid. I think it's something that we're keen to start doing during the course of next year. But as a couple of people have pointed to, there have been some specific unusual circumstances over the last few months that we want to try and get a bit of space behind us with those to sort of see what a truer level of take up might be. But also the fourth of our 4 employers has only been implementing JARS in the last few weeks, and therefore we want to make sure we give them some time before we start sharing stats. But we'll certainly be doing that during the course of next year sometime. But sort of related to that and still on take up, we had a question here which, if someone else hadn't asked it, I think I would have done, Sasha, which is for you, because you said you're looking at doing a version of opt out, as in requiring people to opt out of saving through Fair for All Finance. Just interested to hear a bit more about that. I mean, the question that's been asked is specifically around kind of employee attitudes to that. Do you think people will respond well or badly to the idea that you're sort of defaulting them into something like this and letting them opt out? But also just any broader thoughts you have on the implementation of that. And then I might ask Joe to just say a little bit about kind of some of our thinking about trying to trial some of this over the next year.
It's probably worth framing that we probably got some really advantageous circumstances in that we're an organisation that's been specifically set up to focus on financial inclusion, and with a specific focus on testing out which products and services and which ways of doing things are actually going to help increase people's financial resilience. And so we've just gone through that exercise of looking actually at a whole benefits package to say, right, if we know that there are all these different elements of potential vulnerability points for people in terms of, their level of savings, but also their preparedness to cope with life event shocks or health shocks. What are all the different things that we would want to be modelling of saying, well, actually, this is what it takes in 2020 to provide that support for people? So we've also put in, for example, looking at our pension side of things, is that, we know that there's a rule of thumb, and I'll be looking at all the pension people on the call can actually now shake their heads or put their thumbs up if I got it right. But we've given our people a sort of an idea of, look, when you start saving into your pension, you sort of want to be saving, as a rule of thumb, half your age as a percentage into your pension scheme. Now, what we recognised was that, for our people who are, 30, saying to them you need to save 15% into your pension scheme is a bit of a like, yeah, ha ha ha, you're having a laugh. And so we really need to look at, well, what was it that we could do that would make it possible for them to do that? So we've had that conversation, really starting that conversation on what does it take to create resilience, and then from that use that to actually design out our package. But we're a tiny team. We've got, at the moment, we're sort of 15 of us, so we've been able to have that conversation in a very rounded way. But we've also set it up that, and I think this is the interesting thing in terms of the experimentation on dynamics, we're saying that, it will automatically go into a savings account. You can draw it down at any point. All we're doing is adding some friction into that. So if they straight away say, yeah, I don't want to save anything, I've draw it down, they can. That's the design that we're building in, but just recognizing that sometimes that friction is what will actually help people to actually save. And so that's all we're sort of building in, really. So we'll report back on how it goes and if it's effective. But yeah, I think particularly, there is just this real opportunity, I think, for all of us as employers to think about what are all the different things in terms of our policies that inadvertently creating bad habits or building in lack of resilience because we haven't sort of been bold enough to try some different stuff out. Really, it's lovely hearing the people on the call in terms of what they're doing. And Marion, I do love your job title too. It's fantastic.
Great, thanks,
Thank
Sasha.
you.
I mean, do you want to just do a minute or so, just sort of reminding people of our plans for the sort of opt-out piece?
Yeah, sure. So I think in many ways what we're seeing in our research around JARS is sort of similar to what we saw and heard around workplace pension saving in the run-up to 2012. We're hearing that people want to be saving. The response to JARS is really positive from employees, but we're also hearing that I just didn't get round to signing up. And we're going to share some of those sort of early learnings from the employee perspective next year in a similar way to what we're sharing here from the employer perspective. But I think, with pensions, for most people, the barrier was inertia or choice overload or just kind of lack of time, or it never gets to the top of priority list, or it's too far off. It wasn't not wanting to save. And I think we're hearing the same thing from employees here. And I think the other thing that we're hearing from the employer side in this research is there is kind of a limit to communications and engagement bandwidth in the employment setting, particularly in a year where we're all having to take up quite a lot of that bandwidth with, are you working from home? Are you not? What are the new health and safety regulations that apply with COVID? There is a limit to what you can do in engagement in a workplace, even with something that people want. So we think that an opt-out joining mechanism has real potential for this sidecar saving, in the same way that we've seen that potential has been realised in workplace pension saving. And I think the other thing that, as we work through sort of some of the thinking about what the journey would be like to get to an opt-out mechanism for both employers and employees, in a way we've done the difficult job with pension saving, because unless you opt out of auto enrolment pension saving, that money is kind of locked up for you until you're 55 in most circumstances. In the context of sidecar savings, actually, if you don't opt out, you can still get to that money. It's an instant access savings account until you get to the point of the pension rollover. So there are lots of things coming together there that mean that we think, as Sasha said, the power of the default, the power of flipping that from opt-in to opt-out could be really great. And early learnings from people who are using JARS is that it is having a positive impact on their financial well-being. So we're really keen to explore those things next year. We're working with the FCA under their regulatory sandbox to work through some of those considerations. We will be looking for an employer to run a trial with us. So if there is anybody who is interested in that idea, please do get in touch. Probably quite a big employer from the sort of research data collection point of view, although I will be very keen to hear how things go. Sasha at Fair for All Finance. So yeah, really excited to sort of take the learnings and sort of look at alternative joining mechanisms, and in particular the opt-out one next year.
Great, thank you, Joe. So a number of additional questions have come in the last few minutes, so we're obviously not going to get time to address them all. I mean, what I will say to thank you to everybody who's asked a question, and we will try and find ways to pick up with you kind of outside of this, particularly if there are some technical questions in here that we could probably try and pick up outside of the discussion. But I'm going to stop there on the questions from the audience and just finish with one final question to all of you, just very quickly. A number of you have mentioned the really strong reasons why an employer might want to do this, both out of obligation to their employees, but also because there's a business case for doing it. But got to also recognise that now, especially, but all the time, employers have a lot on their plates, and it's a big ask to be trying to implement something new like this. So just welcome any final thoughts on kind of what can be done to try and make sure as many employers as possible who might want to do this can do it. How can we try and bring something like this to a greater number of employers? Just any final thoughts. I'll run quickly round in order of my screen. So Kerry first.
No, I mean, we I come at this obviously from the benefit of having lots of resource, but we found it relatively easy to implement. But on the automatic piece, I was quite interested to hear Joe's comment about speaking to the FCA, because I think and we suffered the same when we put in the salary finance loan product. You do just need to be careful around those FCA points and how far you can or cannot promote these things. So it's quite interesting to see that eased a little. I think be great.
Great, thanks, Kerry. And Marion, any final thoughts?
I think for me, it just helps the business look they just make them a kinder business and a more thoughtful business for their colleagues, and they're helping their colleagues to look at their finances in a different way, be more responsible for them. And we're also showing a responsibility to them to help them to look after their finances. So I think it's just a really good, it's a good addition to a benefit package.
Thanks, Marion. Gemma?
Yeah, so I think resources is obviously an issue. I think what I'd say is that there is a really strong business case as we've talked about, and the employer is in a really good place to kind of start that. I'd probably also say that it's not necessarily about adding lots of new things, but actually it can be about leveraging what might already be in place as well. I'm working with a client at the moment who's looking to select a new pension provider, and when we talked about financial well-being and how the pension may play a role in that, they said, well, financial well-being is the foundation of all well-being. So actually, there's lots that we can be doing and lots of ways that we can be getting more creative in terms of using and leveraging what might already be in place as well.
Perfect, thanks, Gemma. Asesh, just almost out of time, just any final quick thoughts?
We spend a heck of a lot of money on technology to make it simple for employers, and so yeah, it is less work than come across that first blush.
Perfect, thank you. And Sasha, any final thoughts?
Stories, stories, stories. The more you can share stories with people that show that it's not scary, that it's not hard, and where big organisations are able to support in developing just simple guides so that organisations that don't have a lot of resources can learn from your experience so they can do it, is something that can be incredibly powerful. So yeah, for those who've already done it, use your power, because then you can change a lot more than just your organisation.
Perfect. Well, listen, thank you to our brilliant panel. You've done a great job. It's been a really great conversation. We've run out of time. We could have gone on for a lot longer given some of the questions we've had. Thank you also to our partners on this project, BlackRock, JPMorgan Chase Foundation, and the Money and Pension Service, who make this whole project possible for us. Please do check out this briefing paper and the one we published a few weeks back, and look out for the third in the series, which will be coming in the new year, which looks more at the employee experience and what we've learned about that so far. And a final plug, our Nest Insights last event of 2020 will be on Monday, which is part of our programme of work on supporting the self-employed to save for retirement and for the longer term, and also exploring a bit more in depth the impact of COVID-19 on that group. So please join us for that on Monday. Details on our website, or get in touch if you want to know any more. Other than that, thank you all for joining us. It's been a great session. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks to all of our audience, and we'll hope to see you all soon. Thank you.